She walked into that barn with nothing but a cast iron skillet and a locket she'd never once thought to open. Inside it, a note, 7 words, written by a woman who couldn't say the truth out loud, so she hid it against a dead child's skin and prayed the right person would find it. That person was Vera Calloway, and she had just walked straight into the man who wrote her name and wanted notices in 3 counties because he knew what she was carrying. This is how she brought him down. There is a moment near the end of this story that nobody in the Valley of Harrow Flats would ever forget. A woman stood in the center of Hanson's barn, surrounded by 200 people who had gathered for a harvest celebration and found themselves witnesses to something else entirely. The fiddle had gone silent. The children had stopped running. Every man and woman in that barn had turned to face her, and the only sound was the wind pressing against the wooden walls from outside, steady and without opinion, the way wind is when everything else has stopped. The woman reached into the collar of her dress and pulled out a small silver locket on a thin chain. She opened it. She removed a folded piece of paper no bigger than a playing card. And then she read it aloud, her voice steady and clear, not asking for permission, not begging for mercy, not explaining herself to anyone in that room, just delivering the truth the way a person delivers something that has been carried too long and too far and has finally arrived at the place it was always meant to go. The words on that paper were not hers. They had been written by someone else in fading violet ink, in the kind of handwriting that belonged to a woman who had been taught to form her letters beautifully and had spent years being careful about everything except the one moment that mattered most. When she finished reading, the man she was reading it to went the color of old chalk. That moment was 10 days away from where this story begins. To understand how a woman who arrived at Mercer Ranch with nothing but a cast iron skillet ended up holding the proof that would bring down the most powerful man in the territory, you have to go back to the morning she fell through the gate. You have to go back to 4 days of walking to split boots and a ruined dress and 60 miles of Montana summer that had tried every way it knew to finish her off and had not managed it. You have to go back to 3 words. Vera Calloway had been walking for 4 days. Not the kind of walking where you rest when your feet hurt and stop at noon when the sun gets high, and find shade and drink water, and remind yourself that tomorrow will be easier. The kind of walking where stopping means dying, where every ridge you crest feels like the last one your legs will carry you over, where the boots on your feet have been split open since the 2nd day, and the leather flaps against the dry ground with every step like something trying to leave you behind, like even your shoes have decided there is no future in this and would prefer to make their own arrangements. She had started with 60 miles between herself and the town of Helena. She had $1.40 sewn into the hem of her underskirt, a dress that had already been old when she put it on, and a cast iron skillet tied to her belt with a strip of leather cut from a saddlebag she had found on the road sometime on the first afternoon, lying in the dust as though someone had dropped it in a hurry and not looked back. The skillet was heavy. Cast iron always is. Heavier than anything a person should carry when they are running for their life. When every ounce they carry is an argument their body will eventually make against continuing. But it was the last thing in the world that belonged to her, and she wasn't going to leave it on the side of a road in Montana to rust into the dirt. Everything else had been taken. Her name, her standing, her son. The skillet stayed. She had heard about Mercer Ranch from a woman at a trading post 2 days out of Helena. A woman old enough and weathered enough that she had moved past the age of softening things for strangers. A rancher out past the Harrow Flats Basin, she had said, not looking up from her work. Lost his wife a few years back. Runs the place with a small crew. Keeps to himself. Not friendly, but not cruel neither. Not cruel. In the lexicon of options available to Vera Calloway at that particular moment in her life, not cruel was the entire top of the list. It was the only qualification she needed and the only one she had any right to ask for. She came over the last ridge just as the morning was starting to turn mean with heat, the way Montana mornings in summer make a decision around 9 o'clock and commit to it without apology. The ranch sat below her in the basin, the kind of place that looked like it had grown there, rather than been built low and weathered and permanent in the way that only things exposed to enough seasons eventually to become. Fence lines ran straight in both directions from the gate, the kind of straight that comes from a man who believes that how you build a fence says something true about how you intend to conduct yourself. A barn. A bunkhouse set back from the main house by 50 yards. A main house with a covered porch that faced east toward the road the way porches face east out here, so you can watch what is coming in the morning light before it arrives. She made it through the gate, then her legs simply stopped working. Not gradually, not with warning. They just stopped the way a machine stops when it has run past the end of what it had in it, and she went down on both knees in the dust, her hands hitting the ground. A half second later, the skillet clanging hard against her hip and sending a sound across the quiet yard that had no business being as loud as it was. She did not try to get up. Her body had made a decision without consulting her. And the decision was that this was as far as it was going to go for the moment, and the moment was going to last as long as it needed to. She heard the front door of the house open. She raised her head. The man who stepped onto the porch was tall and unhurried, which are two qualities that tend to go together in men who have lived long enough in open country to have stopped being surprised by it. He wore a blue work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and over it a brown leather vest worn soft from years of use. The kind of wear that is not damage but history. The kind that accumulates in a garment the way experience accumulates in a face and cannot be reproduced by any other means. He had a Winchester rifle in his right hand and a coffee cup in his left, and he carried both with the ease of a man who had been doing this long enough that neither of them required his full attention. His face was weathered and still, the kind of face that had made a long peace with hard weather and longer silences, and the particular quality of solitude that comes from running a working ranch in the Montana Basin, where the nearest neighbor is a significant ride, and the nearest town is farther than that. And most of your conversations are with horses and fence posts and the occasional hand who has learned that you do not speak until spoken to. He did not raise the rifle. He did not lower it either. He looked at her for a moment, assessed her the way a man assesses something he is not sure about, and then he looked past her up the road she had come from, studying the ridge in the distance, with the particular attention of someone who had learned through experience rather than temperament that trouble very rarely announced itself. Vera looked up at him from her knees. Her lips were cracked from 4 days of sun and wind. Her face was burned dark, and her hair had come entirely loose from whatever she had done with it on the morning she left Helena and had been deciding its own arrangements ever since. Her eyes had stopped producing tears somewhere around the second day, because her body did not have the water to spare for grief, had redirected everything it had toward the more immediate project of staying alive long enough to have grief later. She said the only 3 words she had left. I can cook. The man on the porch held his gaze on the road behind her for one long beat, long enough that she thought he had simply decided not to respond, which was his right and which she had no argument against. Then he looked down at her. He looked at the skillet that had clanged against her hip when she fell. He looked at the split boots and the ruined dress and the particular way she held her chin level even from the dirt, which is something a person either has or does not have and cannot manufacture in the moment. He took a slow sip of his coffee. That's enough, he said. Get inside. He came down the porch steps and helped her to her feet with one hand. His grip was hard and steady, the gray of a man whose hands have spent 11 years of ranch work becoming exactly what they needed to be. He did not ask her name. He did not ask where she had come from or what she was running from or whether the men on the ridge behind her were the kind that gave up when they lost the trail or the kind that did not. He walked her through the front door and pointed to a chair beside the kitchen table. Sit, I'll get water. She sat. Her hands were shaking badly enough that she tucked them under her thighs so he would not see. He set a tin cup in front of her, and she picked it up and drank it in 4 swallows and set it back down. Slower, he said, already refilling it from the pitcher. She nodded and picked up the second cup and drank it slower. Her stomach cramped hard enough to blur her vision, but she did not make a sound because making sounds about pain was something she had learned to stop doing a long time ago in another house, in another kind of silence. His name was Colt Mercer. He told her that after the second cup of water, standing in the kitchen doorway, with his arms crossed and his hat pushed back on his head, watching her the way a man watches weather. He is not sure about that particular combination of attentiveness and patience. That means he has not made up his mind yet and is not going to be rushed into it. He had been running this ranch for 11 years, 5 hands, cattle and horses, and the seasonal work of keeping a working spread alive through good years and bad. He had a foreman named Holt Briggs who ran the outfit tight and had opinions about strangers that tended toward the unfavorable, And he was telling her this not as a warning, but as information she might find useful in navigating the next few hours. "How long since you ate? 4 days, she said. "Maybe. I lost count somewhere in the middle." He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man doing arithmetic he does not particularly like the answer to. Then he went to the pantry and came back with cold biscuits, left from the morning, the three of them on a plate, and set them on the table in front of her, without ceremony, without comment, without the particular quality of performance that some people bring to acts of generosity in order to make sure they receive proper credit. She did not ask him why he had let her in. She was not sure she wanted to know the answer yet, because some kindnesses are easier to accept before they have been explained, and she had been walking for 4 days, and her reserves for complicated things were very low. She had eaten 2 biscuits and was working on the third when the back door opened and the foreman walked in. Holt Briggs was 42 years old, with a face that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts by someone who valued function over aesthetics and had not been wrong to do so. Everything about it communicated assessment, the kind of face that processed rooms and people and situations simultaneously and registered its conclusions in the set of the jaw and the angle of the eyes, rather than in anything as communicative as an expression. He stopped when he saw Vera. He looked at her. He looked at Colt. His face did not change, which was itself a kind of statement. "We need a word," he said, not to Vera, to Colt. With the economy of a man who did not waste syllables on people who were not part of the conversation being requested. "Keep eating," Colt said to Vera, and followed Holt to the far end of the porch. Through the wall, she could not hear them. She did not need to. She had seen that look on Holt Briggs' face the moment he walked in, the look of a man who has connected a name to a face and is not comfortable with the connection, and she knew what category of conversation that look belonged to. She kept eating the biscuit and waited for whatever would come next, because waiting was something she had practice with. What Holt told Colt, standing on the porch in the building morning heat, with the dust settling in the yard below them and the smell of coffee and something cooking coming through the kitchen window, was this. 3 weeks ago, Holt had been in Billings on ranch business. He had been standing near the post office on the main street when a man read a notice aloud from the board, outside the kind of public announcement that gathers a small audience of people who are not particularly busy and are therefore available to have an opinion about other people's trouble. The name in the notice was Vera Calloway. The notice described 3 separate counties in which she was wanted: theft, fraud, criminal neglect of a child in her care. 3 counties. Holt had thought nothing of it at the time, because names on notices meant very little to a man who did not know the name. But standing in the kitchen doorway 5 minutes ago, looking at this woman with her split boots and her hollow face and her cast iron skillet lying on his kitchen floor, he had made the connection. "Someone built that before she got here," Colt said. 3 counties, Holt said. "That takes time and money and relationships in 3 separate jurisdictions. A man does not put together 3 counties of notices for a woman who stole a piece of jewelry. That is a man constructing a record." Colt was quiet. He was looking out past the fence line the way he looked at things when he was thinking rather than reacting, which was how he approached most things worth approaching. "She made it 60 miles on nothing," he said. "That's not a reason to bring trouble onto this property." "No," Colt agreed, "it's not." He was still looking at the fence line. "But it might be a reason to find out what the trouble actually is before we decide what we're going to do with it." Holt did not argue. Holt almost never argued, because arguing required a degree of investment in the outcome, a need to be heard that he had decided long ago was not worth the energy it cost. He registered his objection once and let it stand and moved on. He had registered it. He went to tell the hands that supper would be cooked by someone who knew what she was doing and that they were to behave accordingly, and he did not explain anything further, because further explanation was not required. That evening, Vera cooked. She moved through a stranger's kitchen the way certain people move through any unfamiliar space, not tentatively but carefully, with the deliberate economy of someone who has spent a lifetime working in other people's houses and has learned to understand a room before she uses it, to find where things are kept and why they are kept there, and what the kitchen can do and what it cannot. She found the pantry. She found what was in it. She found the smokehouse built into the hillside out back, in the kitchen garden, along the south fence where someone had been keeping it alive, but not lovingly, and the hen house where the hens had opinions about being disturbed at dusk and expressed those opinions at volume. There were 5 ranch hands plus Colt and Holt. She cooked for 8 as though she had been cooking for 8 in this kitchen for years. She had smoked elk from the smokehouse and potatoes from the garden cellar, and the kind of biscuits that require a specific knowledge of flour and lard and heat that cannot be learned from a recipe, but only from years of doing it correctly and understanding why. She made them with blistered hands in a body that had been walking for 4 days, in a mind that needed the work more than the work needed her, and she made them exactly right. The hands came in from the day at the end of the afternoon, the particular exhausted efficiency of men who have been doing hard physical work since before the sun and have stopped expecting anything from the evening except food and horizontal. Cody Marsh, 23 years old with the kind of energy that has not yet learned it is finite, sat down and immediately began talking about nothing in particular to nobody in particular, which was apparently his standard operating procedure and one that everyone else at the table had made their peace with. Fen Aldridge sat at the far end of the table and said nothing. He had said nothing since Vera's arrival that morning and appeared to have no plans to change his position on the matter. He watched everything in the room with the focused attention of a man who has learned that watching is more useful than speaking, and in his case this was probably true. The other two hands, Birch and Dupree, came in muddy from the east fence and sat down with the practiced efficiency of men for whom supper is a serious business, and social commentary is a luxury they have not budgeted for. When Vera set the plates down, the table went still. Not politely still. Not the performative quiet of people pretending to be more appreciative than they are. The involuntary kind, the kind that happens when something cuts through the accumulated weight of fatigue and hunger in the specific hollowness of a long physical day and arrives somewhere deeper, somewhere that does not require thinking about. Cody Marsh, who had been talking continuously for approximately 4 minutes, simply stopped. Colt picked up his fork. He took a bite. He chewed. He set the fork down. Vera, yes. Tomorrow isn't a question anymore. She nodded once and turned back to the kitchen. She did not smile. The occasion was too serious for smiling the way certain things are too real for the ordinary responses to them. But something in her shoulders changed as she turned away, some particular heldness that had been there since before Helena released its grip slightly, just enough for her to stand a different way. Behind her, she heard Cody say something under his breath that involved the phrase, "Lord have mercy," and she heard Holt tell him without particular emphasis to eat his food, and she heard the sound of men eating a meal that was better than they had expected, which is one of the quietest and most honest sounds in the world, the sound of people being cared for without being asked to acknowledge it. She stood at the stove with her hands at rest for the first time in 4 days, and she let something loosen in her chest. Just a fraction. Just enough to breathe. At some point during the meal, Cody reached across the table for a second biscuit before Birch had finished his first, and Holt, without looking up from his own plate, caught Cody's wrist in one hand and redirected it back to the table with the absolute calm of a man who has done this specific thing many times and expects to continue doing it. Cody looked at Vera across the kitchen with the expression of someone making a formal complaint to the appropriate authority. Vera looked at Fen, who had been watching the entire exchange from the far end of the table with the level attention he gave everything. Fen said without looking up from his plate, "He always knows." It was the first thing he had said in 8 hours. Cody blinked. Birch came as close to smiling as Birch apparently got. Holt continued eating as though no one had spoken, which was the correct response, and everyone at the table understood it to be so. After supper, after the hands had gone to the bunkhouse and the dishes were washed and put away, Vera came out to the pump in the yard to rinse the skillet. The sky was still holding the last of the day's light in the west, that long Montana summer dusk that does not give up the day so much as negotiate a gradual settlement with the dark trading light for light in small increments until the stars make the argument that the negotiation is over. Colt was on the porch with his coffee the way she would come to understand he was on the porch most evenings. His rifle was leaned against the wall beside him, and his hat was on the railing, and he was looking at nothing in particular with the focused quality of a man whose mind is working on something while his body rests. She worked the pump handle and let the cold water run over the iron. "The men who were behind you on the road," he said. "Tell me about who sent them." She told him about Clark Drummond. She told him about his house in Helena, the position as a live-in domestic, the arrangement that her infant son could stay with her while she worked because she had nowhere else for him to be and no one else to leave him with, and Mrs. Drummond had been generous about it, had said she did not mind, had in fact seemed to welcome the presence of a baby in the house in a way that Vera had found touching at the time and thought about differently now. She told him about the Drummond household, the money and the connections, and the way Clark Drummond moved through every room he entered as though it had been waiting specifically for him and was now fulfilling its purpose. She told him about Jacob. She said his name, and then she said the facts of him, because the facts were all she had left that belonged entirely to her, and she was not going to dress them in anything that might make them easier to hear. Jacob had been born on the 3rd of June. He had been 11 weeks old when he died. She said this without decoration, the way you say a fact that is so large, it has burned away everything around it and left only itself standing in the empty space. She had come upstairs on the morning of the 9th of August to find the room where he slept empty, the small wooden crib with his folded blanket, the particular quality of absence that only exists in a room where something living has been and is no longer. Mrs. Drummond had been standing in the hallway with her hands clasped in front of her, pale and very still, the stillness of someone who has already said the thing they needed to say to themselves and is now waiting to say it to someone else. Jacob had stopped breathing in the night, she said. Crib fever, nothing anyone could have done. It happened sometimes with infants. There was no predicting it, no preventing it. The doctor had confirmed everything was as it appeared. She said all of this in the even measured tone of someone delivering information they have organized carefully. By the time Vera had understood what she was being told, Jacob was already in the churchyard. She had not been given the chance to hold him one last time. She had not been called when it happened. She had not been told until it was sealed and finished, and the only thing remaining was a small, mounded grave with a wooden marker and a woman in a hallway telling her in a careful voice that it was nobody's fault. She had gone back to her room that night and reached for her locket, the silver oval on the thin chain that her mother had left her, the one she had clasped around Jacob's neck the morning he was born, because she wanted him to have something of hers against his skin. It was gone from where she kept it. She had found it 3 days later in Mrs. Drummond's jewelry case, sitting among the other pieces as though it belonged there, as though it had always been there, as though the name and the date inscribed inside it meant nothing to anyone who had not carried it and lost it. When she took it back, Clark Drummond had called it theft. He had said the word with the same composure he used for everything, the way a man says a word when he has already decided it is true and is informing you rather than accusing you. He had put her name on notices in 3 counties. He had sent men. She had been running for 4 days. Colt listened to all of it without speaking, without moving, with the complete and unhurried attention of someone who is going to hear everything before he says anything. When she finished, the silence held for a long time. "Show me the locket," he said. She reached under the collar of her dress and unclasped it. She held it out across the dark between them, and he came down from the porch step and took it in his hand and held it up to the last of the fading light and turned it over, then opened it. Inside, where the small oval space of a locket waits for whatever its owner puts there, there was a folded piece of paper. A scrap, really. The kind of thing you fold small and tuck inside a space that needs filling, the kind of insertion that says, "I am here," without saying anything else. At least that was what Vera had believed was inside it. She had placed a strip of cloth there herself years ago because an empty locket felt wrong, and she had nothing else at the time. She had assumed it was still there. She had never opened the locket after clasping it around Jacob's neck. She had taken it back from the jewelry case in the dark, with Drummond's voice already rising in the hallway, and run, and never once in 4 days of running thought to open it. Colt unfolded the paper. He read it once. Then he read it again more slowly, with the expression of a man who is making sure he has understood something before he responds to it. Then he held it out to her. She read it for the first time. The paper was small and the handwriting was fine and deliberate, the kind taught in schools where you practiced your letters until they came out right, and the ink had faded to a violet so pale it was almost the color of nothing, almost just the impression of having been there. But the words were legible, clear enough, brief enough that there was no mistaking them. "Forgive me, I should have called for you." Vera's hand went very still around the paper. She had taken the locket back in a hurry in the dark, in the middle of everything falling apart at once. She had never looked inside it. She had carried it across 60 miles of Montana summer pressed against her skin and never once thought to open it because she had known what was inside it. A strip of cloth, a placeholder. Someone had replaced the cloth. Someone inside the Drummond house in the hours or the days between when Jacob died and when Vera retrieved the locket from the jewelry case had taken out whatever had been there and put this piece of paper in its place. Someone who needed this specific information to leave that house without being searched. Someone who understood that Vera Calloway was the one person who would carry it far enough away that it could not be taken back and buried. Someone who knew what had happened and could not live with knowing and had found the only way available to her to say so. Colt looked at the paper in her hand, then he looked at her. Drummond isn't chasing a thief, he said quietly with the particular precision of someone placing a conclusion on the table carefully as though it might break if set down wrong. He's chasing a witness. She had not thought of it that way. She had been too busy surviving to think about it as anything other than the cruelest possible ending to 4 months of loss. But standing at the pump in the fading dark with the wet skillet in one hand and the small pale paper in the other, she understood what Colt Mercer had understood the moment he read it. This note, written in the handwriting of the woman who lived in that house, said that something had been left undone, that someone had made a choice not to call for help when help was still possible, that the story Clark Drummond had been telling about crib fever and the unknowable cruelties of nature and the arrangements made with such expedient care was not the whole story. If this paper reached someone who had the standing to ask questions, Drummond's version of events would not survive the asking. That night, Vera lay on the cot in the small room off the kitchen and held the locket against her chest in the dark and did not sleep for a long time. The clock on the kitchen wall ticked through the thin wall between them, steady and indifferent marking time she could not afford to waste. Jacob. She said his name in the dark, not aloud, just in the part of her that still held the shape of him, the part that would always hold the shape of him. 11 weeks. The weight of him in her arms. The specific smell of the top of his head, the one that belongs only to infants, and which she had not understood was finite until it was gone. The way his fingers would curl around one of hers with a grip that seemed impossible for something so small, as though he was already practicing holding on. She pressed the locket tighter against her chest and let the dark be what it was. On the second morning, Odie rode into the Harrow Flats township for supplies and came back before noon with the news already visible in the way he rode, the set of his shoulders and the pace of his horse, the particular quality of someone carrying something they would prefer not to be carrying. He sat down at the kitchen table without taking his hat off, which meant something without his having to say it. Clark Drummond had arrived in Harrow Flats the previous afternoon. He was at the Harrow Hotel with 2 men whose primary qualifications were their size and their willingness to apply it in useful directions. He had already visited the office of Judge Aldous Crane, a man known locally for his careful attention to his own financial interests, and the visit had gone well for everyone involved. A warrant had been signed. A deputy from Helena was on the circuit and would arrive to execute it. "How long?" Colt said. Cody paused, still looking for the soft part of the news and still not finding it. 10 days. Deputy rides the circuit." Colt looked at Holt. Holt looked at the table. 10 days was not very much time. But it was Colt understood exactly the right amount of time for a patient and intelligent man to ensure that by the time a formal legal instrument arrived the community, it was arriving into already believed his version of events so completely and so thoroughly that the warrant would feel like confirmation rather than accusation. Not a question being asked, but an answer being delivered to a question that had already been answered. Clark Drummond had not come to Harrow Flats to arrest Vera Calloway. He had come to bury her. The arrest was going to be the shovel. That evening, from the second floor of the Harrow Hotel, Clark Drummond sat at the writing desk and worked with the methodical patience of a man who understood that the most effective kinds of destruction are the ones that look as though they happen naturally, the way a tree falls and no one asks why. He was not a large man, but he had the kind of presence that caused rooms to arrange themselves around him without his asking, the presence that comes from 20 years of being the person in any given room who has the most money and has been the most money for long enough that he has stopped noticing it. He dressed well regardless of weather or setting, which in Montana summer meant he was perpetually the least comfortable person anywhere he went and showed none of it. He had been managing situations like this one for 2 decades. The specifics changed. The method did not. You did not chase a problem. You surrounded it. You built a structure of belief so thoroughly and carefully around the narrative. You needed people to accept that by the time anyone thought to question it, the questioning itself looked like the unreasonable thing. He wrote notes. He considered which conversations to have tomorrow, and in what order and in what tone. He considered the harvest gathering being planned for 10 days hence, the kind of community event where the entire valley would be present in one place, and the natural social mechanisms of shared belief would accomplish in 2 hours what a month of individual conversations could not. He had used such gatherings before. They were reliable. He thought briefly about his wife Constance, who had remained in Helena. He started to think about what she might do, what she might say to someone if the opportunity arose, and then he set the thought down firmly and did not pick it back up, because thinking about Constance required thinking about the morning of the 9th of August, and the particular way she had looked at him in the hallway after she said what she said, and thinking about that was not useful to him right now. He focused on what he could manage. He was very good at managing things. On the third morning, Vera was in the kitchen before the sun came over the eastern ridge, moving through the pre-dawn dark by the geography of a kitchen she had already mapped completely in 2 days, because learning a kitchen was something she did the way other people learned language, automatically and thoroughly, and without having to think about it. Coffee first, eggs from the hen house, bacon from the smokehouse, the thick-cut kind, biscuits, because biscuits every morning was the kind of consistency that a working ranch required more than it required variety. Holt came in while the coffee was still brewing. He sat down at the table and wrapped both hands around the cup she set in front of him and looked at it without drinking for a moment. They did not speak for a while. The kitchen was quiet in the particular way of early mornings when the work of the day has not yet started, and the dark outside the windows is still the dark of night rather than the dark of early morning. "I was wrong about something," Holt said eventually. He said it the way he said most things, without preamble, without building toward it. She turned from the stove. "That first morning," he said. He was looking at his coffee cup the way a man looks at something when he finds he cannot make himself look at the person he's addressing. "When Colt brought you inside, I thought the trouble was you, that it was coming with you and would land on this ranch." "I know," she said. "I saw it on your face." "I was looking at what was following you," he said, instead of asking why it was following you. He picked up his cup and drank and set it down again with a precision that suggested the gesture was completing a thought rather than satisfying a thirst. "Won't happen again," he said. She turned back to the biscuits. There was nothing she could say to that which would not make it smaller than it was, so she said nothing, and Holt seemed to understand that this was the right response and was satisfied with it. The biscuits came out right. They always came out right. It was the one thing in Vera Calloway's life that had traveled with her through every house and every room, and 4 days of Montana dust, and come out the other side undiminished. She could make a kitchen feel like the center of something. She could take what was available and turn it into something that made people stop and be present for a moment in a way that ordinary food did not require them to be. It was not everything, but it was something that belonged entirely to her, and no one had ever found a way to take it. Just before noon, a rider came up the road from town and stopped at the gate without coming through it. He sat on his horse and waited, which was either courtesy or calculation, and either way, it brought Colt down from the porch with his rifle in the crook of his arm and his hat on his head. The rider handed a folded note through the fence rails without dismounting. Vera watched from the kitchen window. She watched Colt read it, read it again, fold it, and slide it into the breast pocket of his brown leather vest. She watched him say something to the rider, brief and final. She watched the rider turn his horse and go back down the road toward town without looking back. Colt came back to the house and into the kitchen and held the note out to her. She took it. She read it. It was brief and dressed in the language of courtesy, the way certain threats dress themselves, wearing civility as a coat over something that would not be presentable without it. Clark Drummond wished to resolve the matter quietly and privately and without the involvement of formal law. He invited her to present herself at the Harrow Hotel before sundown. He hoped she was well. He assured her his intentions were as they had always been, fair and considerate. She read it twice. She set it on the table. She picked up the rolling pin and turned back to the bread dough she had been working before the rider appeared. She pressed the heels of her hands into the dough and pushed. "What do you want to do?" Colt said from the doorway. She did not look up. "You said I could stay." "I did." "Then I'm staying." She folded the dough and pushed again. Behind her, she heard Colt pick up the note and hold it for a moment and then set it back down on the table. "I'll send him an answer in the morning," he said. He went back outside. She heard his boots on the porch and then the quiet of the yard. Vera stood at the kitchen table with flour on her hands and the bread dough under her palms and the locket at her throat warm from her skin. Through the window, the afternoon light was lying hard and flat on the yard and the fence line and the road that led to town, the kind of light that shows everything exactly as it is and makes no allowance for how you would prefer it to look. 10 days. She pressed her hands into the dough. She did not run. The fourth morning arrived the way trouble usually does in the middle of something ordinary, without the courtesy of announcing itself first. Vera was at the stove with the bacon when she heard Cody's horse come through the gate. She heard it before she heard the door, and she heard in the particular rhythm of those hoofbeats the difference between a man riding home at the end of an errand and a man riding home carrying something he has not worked out how to set down yet. She kept her hands on the pot and her eyes on the heat and waited. Cody sat down at the kitchen table without removing his hat. He sat there for a moment looking at the table as though it might have something helpful to offer. It did not. He had ridden into Harrow Flats that morning for the twice-monthly supply run, the kind of errand a ranch hand does automatically, the kind that requires no planning and no thought, and usually produces no incident. He had gone to Prine's General Store on the east side of the main street, which had been supplying Mercer Ranch with flour and salt and lamp oil and various other necessaries for 7 years, without the exchange ever being anything other than commercial and unremarkable. Mrs. Prine had told him she was not able to fill the order. She had said it without meeting his eyes, which cost her something. She was not a cruel woman. She was a woman who ran a store in a small valley community and understood that a general store lives and dies on the goodwill of the community it serves. And the goodwill of this particular community was currently being tended by a man in a black suit at the Harrow Hotel who had been buying rounds at the saloon every evening for 3 days and talking in the careful, reasonable, regretful tone of a man who did not want to be doing what he was doing, but had no choice. You understand, no choice at all. She had told Cody that she did not do business with people who harbored thieves. Those were the specific words, and she had the expression of someone repeating a phrase that had been given to her rather than one she had arrived at herself. When Cody finished telling this to Holt and Colt, who had come in from the yard when they heard the horse, the kitchen went quiet. Vera set the bacon pan off the heat. She turned and faced the wall. Her hands found the edge of the counter and held it not with enough force that anyone would notice, just with enough to keep the floor where it was supposed to be while everything else moved. She had known this was coming. She had spent 4 months in Clark Drummond's house, watching the particular way he assembled situations, the way he gathered leverage, the way a careful man gathers tools one at a time with attention to which one will be needed and when, with no wasted motion and no visible effort. He did not operate with anger. He operated with patience and with planning, which were considerably more difficult to defend against. "There's more," Cody said. She turned around. He had spent a few minutes in the saloon, he said. Not drinking, just present, because a young man who can make himself look purposeless in a saloon can learn a great deal without anyone thinking he is paying attention. Drummond had been there the previous 2 evenings, buying drinks and telling his story and letting it evolve, which was what told Cody the most. The latest version involved Vera Calloway poisoning a family in Billings. The version before that had her abandoning her own child to go through drawers and jewelry cases in the Drummond household. The version before that had been somewhat closer to the original, which meant Drummond was testing which elaborations took hold most effectively in this particular community's soil. And there was a witness, a man Drummond had been mentioning carefully, not prominently, just placing the information in conversations the way you place seeds, expecting the rain to do the rest. A man prepared to testify at the harvest gathering now 5 days away that he had personally observed Vera Calloway taking the locket from Mrs. Drummond's jewelry case. Vera listened to all of it with her hands at her sides. Then Cody produced the third thing, reaching into his vest for a piece of paper he had clearly been carrying with some awareness of its weight. 2 years ago, he said, riding through Cheyenne after a cattle sale in Colorado, he had spent a night at a rooming house near the train depot. The common room walls were papered with the standard variety of wanted notices, and he had read them the way a young man reads wanted notices in a rooming house, which is to say, with moderate boredom and a general ambient interest in other people's trouble. He had remembered a specific face, the kind built for the purpose of appearing trustworthy, with wide-set eyes and an open expression that sat on top of something else entirely, the way new snow sits on ice. The name on the Cheyenne notice had been different, but the face Drummond had been describing in connection with his witness, the build the scar above the left eyebrow, was the same face Cody had seen on that wall 2 years ago. Drummond's witness was a professional fabricator, a man who traveled to places where money needed a particular story, told it convincingly, and moved on. "Keep that paper somewhere, you won't lose it," Colt said. Cody tucked it back inside his vest with the gravity of someone who now understood exactly what he was holding. 2 miles down the road, Clark Drummond stood at the window of his hotel room and read the telegram he had just received. He had men watching the roads in and out of Helena. Information was infrastructure, the same as rail line or surveyed right-of-way, and he had spent 20 years building both, and one of them had sent word. Agnes Cole was traveling to Mercer Ranch. He knew Agnes Cole. She had spent 3 weeks in his house the previous spring, a friend of Constance's from their church acquaintance, a woman of 53 who had the straight back and the long memory and the particular kind of moral certainty that develops in women who have spent decades watching the world behave badly and storing the evidence. She had been in the house during the days after Jacob died. She had been in the hallway. She had heard things. He had not considered her a concern at the time. Agnes Cole was a widow who ran a boarding house in a small valley 200 miles from Helena, and the distance between a thing witnessed and a thing spoken in the right place at the right time was a distance he had always been able to manage. He folded the telegram carefully. He held it between two fingers for a moment and looked at the street below without seeing it. Then he sat down and wrote a note to his men and told them to increase their work in town and to have the witness available, rehearsed, and reliable before the gathering. He sealed the note and rang for the messenger. He did not think about Agnes Cole again that evening. Thinking about Agnes Cole required thinking about what she had seen, and what she had seen required thinking about what he had said to Constance in the hallway that morning, and thinking about Constance at all these days had a quality to it that he had decided was not useful and was therefore not going to be indulged. He was very good at deciding things were not useful and therefore not indulging them. It was one of his better skills. On the fifth day, a gray mare came up the road from the west, and behind it on a small pinto, a boy who appeared to be made primarily of elbows and the kind of forward momentum that cannot be contained by any conventional means. Agnes Cole dismounted at the gate with the ease of a woman who had been riding since before the current political administration and handed her reins to Cody with the brisk efficiency of someone who did not require assistance with the ordinary things. She was 53 years old and built like a person who had decided very early that the world was going to demand her full attention indefinitely and had arranged herself accordingly. She wore a black shawl despite the summer heat, with the air of someone who had decided the shawl was part of her and was prepared to defend this position against all weather-related counter-arguments. The boy Sam was 7 years old and had already, before his grandmother had finished speaking to Cody, assessed the barn, the bunkhouse, the fence lines, the well, and the crow on the barn roof, which he had opinions about. "It's been there since we came through the gate," he announced to no one in particular. "I think it's watching." "Crows sit on things, Sam," Agnes said. "Crows watch things on purpose," Sam said. "I read that." Agnes gave him the look of a woman who has been receiving this kind of statement for 7 years and has arrived at a philosophy about it that mostly involves acceptance. She walked toward the house. She found Vera at the stove, and the two women looked at each other across the kitchen with the particular measuring attention of people who have never met and are trying quickly to understand what they are dealing with before the conversation begins. "You're Vera Calloway," Agnes said. "Yes, ma'am." Agnes pulled out a chair and sat down with the directness of a woman who did not come 200 miles to stand in doorways. "I knew your boy." Vera's hand on the spoon went still. "I was in Helena last spring," Agnes said. 3 weeks in the Drummond house while my sister was recovering at the hospital there. I'm acquainted with Constance Drummond through church." She paused. "I held Jacob twice. He had strong lungs, the kind of healthy that announces itself." Vera set the spoon on the rest beside the stove. She turned around. Her hands were at her sides and her face had the expression of someone holding a door closed from the inside, with everything they have, all the weight pressed against it, not allowing anything through in either direction. "I was there the morning they found him," Agnes said. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, Sam was telling the crow something at considerable length, his voice carrying through the window clearly and without self-consciousness, the way children's voices carry when they are engaged in something they consider important. Agnes told it plainly. Without performance, without the particular cadence of storytelling that adds texture to difficult facts, just with the flat dignity of someone delivering information that the world should have addressed a long time ago and did not. She had come downstairs that morning to find Constance Drummond in the front hallway holding Jacob in a blanket. Constance was pale and shaking in the specific way of someone who has been holding something together through pure will and has reached the limit of what will alone can do. She held the child out to her husband when he came in from the study, and Clark Drummond looked at his wife and said 4 words. We will handle it, not call the doctor, not go upstairs immediately to Vera, not any of the things a person says when something terrible has happened by accident, and there is nothing left but to face it together. He said we will handle it in the voice he used for things that needed to be managed rather than addressed, and by that afternoon Jacob was in the churchyard, and Vera had not been told until supper time. Agnes watched Vera absorb this. She did not look away from Vera's face because looking away would have been a kind of cowardice, and Agnes Cole had made her decisions about cowardice. Then she said the other thing, the thing she had driven 200 miles to say, because some wrongs accumulate interest, and the only way to stop the accumulation is to pay what is owed. That was not the first time, she said. Vera looked at her. 3 years before Jacob, Agnes said. There was another girl, a domestic, same as you. An infant, same circumstances. Another burial done quickly and quietly in the middle of a week, with a doctor's note and a story about fever. The young woman left the Drummond household shortly after and was not heard from again. Agnes's jaw was set and her eyes did not move from Vera's face. I only heard about it afterward. Someone in the church told me in confidence. I did not do anything with it. I told myself it was not my business. She stopped. The pot on the stove had begun to simmer. It was my business, she said. I have known that since the morning I walked downstairs and saw Constance Drummond standing in that hallway. I knew it and I left 2 days later because I had a life to return to, and I have not had a full night of sleep since August of last year. The room held this for a moment, the way a room holds the silence that follows something breaking. Clark Drummond has done this at least twice, Agnes said. He buries the children, and he buries the truth, and he destroys the mothers, so there is nothing left to ask questions with. You are not the first, but you can be the last. Sam came through the back door at a velocity that made no concessions to the atmosphere of the room and stopped immediately when he saw the way the two women were facing each other. He had the instincts of someone who was 7 years old and extremely alert, and he understood without analysis that something was happening that he should not interrupt. He looked at the bowl of bread dough on the counter. He looked at Vera. He looked at the bowl again. What are you making of it, he said, because the bread dough was right there. Something in Vera's face changed, not breaking, more like a seam releasing a small opening through which something could pass that had been sealed in. Bread, she said. Can I help him? She pulled a stool to the counter. She showed him how to work the dough, the push and fold and quarter turn, the rhythm that is less about force than about understanding what the dough needs and providing it steadily. Sam attacked it with both fists initially, and she said, gentle, you are not fighting it, you are waking it up. And he slowed down and tried again with his tongue out the side of his mouth and his eyebrows drawn together in concentration. 3 minutes into this process, he reached for the flour tin to dust the board, and his aim was imperfect, and approximately a cup of flour went directly into the large open bag of reserve flour sitting beside the tin on the counter. He looked at the bag. He looked at Vera. I was aiming for the board, he said. I see that. It all ends up in the same bread eventually, he said. This was offered not as an excuse, but as a genuine philosophical observation, the kind that 7-year-olds make with complete sincerity. Holt, who had come in from the yard and was standing in the doorway with his coffee and had witnessed the entire sequence from beginning to end, made no sound. But the corner of his mouth moved in a direction it did not usually move, which Cody, coming through the other door at that precise moment, noticed and filed away as something remarkable. That evening, after Sam had been settled in the loft with a blanket and a biscuit and had delivered one final assessment of the crow situation, Colt found Holt in the barn. The barn at night had a particular quality of quiet that was different from the quiet of the house or the open land. The horses moved occasionally in their stalls. The wood of the barn settled. The smell of hay and warmth and horse made a density in the air that was its own kind of presence, the kind that certain conversations require as a container. Holt was checking tack by lantern light, working the leather through his hands, with the automatic steadiness of a man who needs something to do with his hands, while his mind works on something else. Colt leaned against the stall across from him and waited. He knew how to wait. Holt worked the leather in silence for a while. "I had a sister," he said eventually, not as an announcement. The way a man sets something down that he has been carrying for a long time in the wrong hand. Lily, she was 19 when she took a domestic position in Missouri. Family was well off. Husband was respected in the community. He paused. She had a boy while she was there. She wrote me that the family was kind about it, that the baby could stay with her while she worked. The boy died in that house when he was 4 months old. The family said it was fever. The doctor confirmed it. Nothing to be done. Outside the barn, something small moved in the yard. A horse shifted in its stall. Lily came home, Holt said. She never talked about what she thought had happened. I never asked. Pushing at a wound that deep seemed like cruelty rather than care. He put the tack down and looked at his hands, which had the look of hands that have been doing hard work for 20 years and know it. She drank, not dramatically. The way that kind of grief drinks steadily and without drama. The way water finds its way through stone until there is nothing left to find its way through. She was 25 when she died. He picked up the tack again. I have thought every day since the morning Vera Calloway came through that gate about Lily, about what it would have meant if someone had stood up for her, if someone had asked the questions that needed asking instead of deciding it was not their concern. Colt was quiet for a moment. Then stand up now, he said. Holt looked at him across the lantern light. He nodded once, in agreement, commitment. The kind of nod that closes a door on one thing and opens it on another. Then he went back to the leather. On the 7th day, Vera found Colt in the front room after the hands had gone to the bunkhouse, and the house was quiet. He was sitting in this chair by the window with a small framed photograph on the side table beside him, the glass of water at his elbow untouched. The photograph showed a woman in her mid-30s with dark hair and the kind of direct expression that belongs to people who have decided to be exactly what they are and have stopped putting energy into alternatives. Vera stood into the doorway. She had come for a glass of water and found something else. Her name was Nora, Colt said without turning. He had heard her come in the way he heard everything quietly and without making anything of it. Vera came in and sat in the chair across from him because leaving felt like the wrong thing. He told her about Nora the way the men in this story told difficult things not all at once, not dressed up, but in the measured way of someone who has thought about a thing so many times that the words have worn smooth from use. Nora had been sick in the winter 3 years ago. Not mortally sick at first. The kind of sickness that a Montana winter produces in people who work hard in the cold, the kind that yields to proper treatment and rest. He had sent for the doctor. The doctor was a man named Prescott who held contracts with several ranches in the town of Harrow Flats and attended to his wealthier clients with the kind of urgency that had suggested financial arrangements were a factor in scheduling. Prescott had come. He had examined Nora. He had prescribed rest and a preparation he would bring on his next visit. He scheduled the next visit for 2 weeks out. 2 weeks was a very long time for pneumonia that was not being treated. By the time Prescott came back, Nora was past treating. Colt had tried to find other doctors. He had ridden to 2 other towns in weather that was trying to prevent him. But the 2 weeks waiting for Prescott were the 2 weeks that decided everything, and no amount of riding could recover them. He had thought about this for 3 years. He had thought about Prescott, who had contracts with Drummond's household and attended to the Drummond family's medical needs with the responsiveness that money purchases. He had thought about Clark Drummond, who had been building his railroad land interests in this territory during that same winter, who had been experiencing resistance from certain ranchers who were not interested in selling their land at the prices Drummond was offering. Colt had been one of those ranchers. He had no proof. He had only the arithmetic of it, the way certain events lined up and made a shape if you were willing to look at the shape. He had not been willing to look at it for 3 years because looking at it meant living inside a suspicion so large and so dark that it could swallow the rest of his life if he let it in. But now he said it out loud for the first time. "That man may have taken your son," he said. He may have taken my wife. I have enough reason, and I've been waiting for the right opportunity to do something about it that isn't just a man burning his life down in an empty field. Vera sat across from him in the quiet room and looked at his face, this weathered and steady face above the blue shirt and the worn leather vest, and she understood something about why he had walked down those porch steps and helped her up from the dirt with one hand and asked nothing in return. He had not been saving a stranger. He had been waiting for something that looked like the right opportunity, and she had come through his gate, carrying it around her neck in a silver locket. Neither of them said anything for a while. The flashback arrived without invitation the way they always did. She was in the hallway of the Drummond house, and the words had already been said, and she was still standing in the place where understanding arrives one piece at a time, and each piece is heavier than the last. He is gone. Last night. We have already made the arrangements. Already made the arrangements. Not we called for you immediately. Not come, there is still time to say goodbye. Already made. As though the most urgent question was logistics, and the logistics had been addressed, and what remained was the administrative task of informing the person who needed to be informed. She had not been able to hold him. She pressed her hand flat against her chest and came back to the room, and Colt was still sitting across from her, looking at the photograph of Nora with the expression of a man who has decided that grief is something you carry rather than put down, and has made all his arrangements with it on that basis. She did not say she was sorry because sorry was not the right size for anything in this room. She said goodnight and went back to the kitchen and stood at the window in the dark for a while, looking at the yard and the road, and let the darkness be exactly what it was. The days of preparation arrived with the particular quality of time that moves quickly when you want it to move slowly and slowly when you cannot afford it. Drummond's formal announcement came on the 8th morning, delivered by a rider who had the expression of someone doing a job he had been hired to do and had not been hired to have opinions about. The harvest gathering at Hanson's barn was scheduled for the following day. Clark Drummond would be present. He wished to bring a matter of justice before the community. The warrant from Helena was now 4 days away. The mathematics were clear and deliberate. The gathering would happen before the law arrived. Drummond would present his case to the entire valley in a setting specifically designed for the efficient manufacture and distribution of shared belief. By the time the deputy rode in with his paper, the verdict would already exist in the minds of 200 people, and all the warrant would be doing was ratifying something that had already been decided. Unless something happened first that changed what they believed. That evening, Colt called everyone to the kitchen table. He stood at the head of it. He told them what he believed was going to happen tomorrow. He told each of them what he needed. Holt, stay close, keep the hands together if things turn complicated. Cody, keep Sam out of the center of whatever developed, which was acknowledged as a genuinely challenging assignment. Fen, watch the doors. Agnes, speak when the moment called for it. Say everything she had seen in that house. Then he looked at Vera. When he accuses you, he said, you don't run and you don't shrink. You stand up. You show them the locket. You take out the note and you read it to every person in that barn. Vera looked at the table for a moment, then at him. Can you do that? He said. She looked around the table. At Holt, who had made peace with something 20 years old and was here because of it. At Cody, who had carried a 2-year-old memory from a Cheyenne rooming house wall and produced it when it mattered. At Fen, who said almost nothing and whose nothing was worth more than most men's everything. At Agnes, who had traveled 200 miles to pay a debt she had been carrying for a year. At Sam, sitting on his stack of books at the end of the table, looking at Vera with the uncomplicated certainty of someone who has not yet learned that trust is a thing you can lose. I can do that, she said. After supper, after the table was cleared and the hands had gone and Agnes was reading by the lamp, Vera went out to the yard pump. She stood in the dark holding the locket in her hand, not wearing it, just feeling the weight of it, which was always heavier than the weight of silver had any right to be. She heard Colt come out onto the porch. Tomorrow, she said. Tomorrow, he said. She clasped the locket back around her neck and went inside. She lay on the cot and listened to the clock tick through the wall and thought about what tomorrow would require. She had spent most of her adult life being a useful and largely invisible presence in other people's houses. She had learned to make herself small because small was safer, because the woman who did not take up too much space was the woman who still had work at the end of the month. Standing in front of 200 people and refusing to be small was going to require assembling every piece of herself that she had left. She was still working out how to do that when she heard the sound from the barn. Not a horse sound, the specific sound of a person trying very hard to move without being heard, which is a different sound from silence in a way that someone who has lived with caution long enough learns to identify. She sat up. She sat. She waited. 1 minute. Then the barn door came open from the inside and Fen Aldridge stepped into the yard with his left hand on the collar of a man whose arms were secured behind him with baling twine that Fen had clearly improvised from available materials. The man was built wide and was not cooperating and was finding his lack of cooperation ineffective against Fenn's particular style of management. Colt appeared on the porch. He looked at Fenn. He looked at the man. Fenn said, "He works for Drummond." He paused. The night was still around him. "He's not the only one they sent." Vera stood in the doorway and looked at Fen Aldridge, who had said almost nothing for 9 days and had just spoken 2 full sentences, and understood that he had been sitting in that barn in the dark since before sunset, waiting without being asked, saying nothing about it to anyone, because the work of watching did not require announcing itself. "Get him to the bunkhouse," Colt said. "Keep him there until I say otherwise." Fenn walked the man across the yard. The man said something once, and then after Fenn's response, which was simply silence, said nothing more. Vera held the doorframe with one hand. She went back to the cot. She pressed the locket against her chest in the dark and thought about Jacob. Not the loss of him, not the grief that had been her constant companion since August, but the simple fact of him. 11 weeks of weight in her arms. The particular warmth of his head against her neck. The grip of his fingers. The world had given her 11 weeks with him, and the world could not take those 11 weeks back. They were already counted. They were already real. They had already happened and therefore were permanent in a way that nothing afterward could undo. She thought about the 200 people in that barn tomorrow who did not know any of this yet. She thought about the note in the locket and the woman who had written it and found no other way to say what needed saying. She closed her eyes. For the first time in 10 days, she did not need to decide whether to run. The decision had already been made on a kitchen counter in the dark with flour on her hands and a locket at her throat, and it was going to hold. Hanson's barn sat at the center of the Harrow Flats Valley, the way certain places sit at the center of communities, not because of their size or their construction, but because of what they had absorbed over the years, the accumulated weight of occasions. 30 years of harvests and weddings and the ordinary ceremonial business of people who live far enough apart that when they come together, it means something. A man named Hanson had built it before he fully understood what he was building, and his son ran it now, and opened it every autumn with the same practical generosity his father had shown, which is the best kind of inheritance, the kind that does not diminish with distribution. By the time Colt's wagon came up the road, the field around the barn was already filling with horses and wagons, and the organized disorder of 200 people arriving from 20 directions, with food and children, and the stored social energy of a community that does not get to be together often enough and intends to make the most of it when it does. The man Fenn had apprehended the previous night had been turned over to Deputy Lauren Wick that morning when Drummond's party came through the valley road toward the gathering. Wick had taken custody without a word, put the man on a lead rope behind his horse, and ridden on. It was the first competent thing the deputy had done since his arrival in Harrow Flats, and everyone at Mercer Ranch noted it without saying so. Vera rode in the wagon bed with the stew pot steady between her knees and Agnes beside her with the pies in their cloth wrappings on her lap. Sam sat up front next to Colt on the wagon bench and narrated the landscape with the consistent conviction of someone whose observations were being received with interest by everyone present. "That cloud looks like a man falling off a horse," he said. "Focus," Agnes said from behind him. "I am focused. The cloud is right there." Agnes looked at Vera with the expression she had developed for this kind of exchange, which combined patience with something that might in a more demonstrative person have been called affection. Vera held the side of the wagon and watched the barn grow larger as they approached and let the motion of the wagon do the work of keeping her in the present moment rather than the one coming. Cody rode alongside on his roan and had been unusually quiet for 2 miles, which in Cody's case was more alarming than his usual steady output of commentary because Cody's silent meant Cody thinking, and Cody thinking about something he was trying not to show he was thinking about had the quality of a man carrying something breakable over rough ground while pretending the ground was smooth. Holt rode ahead, not dramatically, just far enough to see the road before the wagon reached it, which was either professional habit or the preference of a man who would rather meet difficult things a few seconds before everyone else so he can have his reaction in private. Fenn was already there. No one had seen him leave the ranch. The morning was clear and committed to its heat the way Montana summer mornings commit without apology, and without the suggestion that the afternoon would be any different. The sky was the specific blue that exists at altitude, hard and deep, and going all the way to the edge of the visible world. Vera set the stew pot on the food table near the east wall of the barn and stood back from it for a moment. Women she had never met glanced at her from across the room and away again. A few whispered to whoever was nearest. She felt it the way you feel weather not needing to see the cloud to know the direction it is coming from. Colt appeared at her shoulder. "Don't look at them," he said quietly enough that only she heard it. "Look at what you made." She looked at the pot. "That's real," he said. "Let it do what it does." He moved away. She stood at the table and ladled the first bowl for an older man who came up without meeting her eyes and walked away and came back 20 minutes later, without a word, and held his bowl out again. She filled it. The fiddle player started up near the far wall, and the children began running the way children run at gatherings, as though movement itself were the entire point. The barn filled. The temperature climbed with bodies and cooking, and the accumulated warmth of people who had come together in the ordinary way without expecting anything difficult to happen. Sam located the fiddle player within 4 minutes of arriving and established himself at what he considered optimal proximity. Cody had been assigned to keep Sam accessible but not centrally located, and the difficulty of reconciling these two requirements was evident on his face. "If I stand here, I can hear better," Sam told him. "You can hear perfectly well from anywhere in this barn. That is not scientifically accurate. Sound travels in waves. Proximity matters." "I'm going to tell Holt you said that." Sam looked toward Holt, who was standing near the barn door with his arms folded and his hat level, and his eyes making a continuous, unhurried circuit of the room. Sam considered whether Holt might know about sound waves, appeared to conclude that the possibility could not be ruled out, and relocated 2 steps back from the fiddle player as a reasonable precaution. Cody exhaled slowly and said nothing. An hour passed, then most of another. The food table filled and was emptied and filled again. Vera served bowl after bowl, and the work of it was the kind of anchor she needed, the familiar physical grammar of feeding people the thing that had been hers through all the years of other people's houses and 4 days of Montana road and everything since. A few women who had been watching from across the barn from behind the careful neutrality of people who have been told something and are not ready to unbelieve it came to the table with their bowls blank-faced and left with them full, and Vera asked nothing of them in return. Mrs. Prine's daughter was 16 and had her mother's practical face and her father's directness, which is a useful combination. She came to the table, held out her bowl, and said clearly enough that her mother could hear it from 3 tables away, "I don't care what anyone says. That is the best stew I have ever eaten in my life." Vera filled the bowl. The girl took it back to her mother. Mrs. Prine looked at the bowl, then at her daughter, then at the floor for a long moment. It was its own kind of statement that, looking at the floor, and Vera noted it and set it aside. Small victories. She had been learning to recognize and accept them. Sam found her at the table during a quiet moment, working on his second bowl of stew, and a piece of pie simultaneously, which he appeared to consider a reasonable allocation of resources. "The man by the water barrel keeps looking at the doors," he said, the matter-of-fact tone of a professional report. "Which man?" "The wide one with the hat that doesn't fit him correctly. He looks at the east door, then the west door, then back at the east door. Nobody normal does that. I've been watching him for 20 minutes. You've been watching him while eating?" "I can do both," Sam said with dignity. He ate a piece of pie. "Also, the crow from the ranch is on the roof. I can hear it. It followed us here." "Crows don't follow people, Sam." "This one does," he said with complete conviction. "I think it's been assigned to us." Cody appeared behind Sam with the expression of a man who had briefly lost track of his primary responsibility and was relieved to have reacquired it. Sam allowed himself to be redirected to a position slightly less central, with the minimal resistance of someone who has already gathered the intelligence he needed. Vera handed him another piece of pie because he had earned it and because he was 7 years old at a harvest gathering, and the world owed him at least that much. Then the fiddle stopped. It stopped in the middle of a phrase, not at the natural end of anything, just halted. And that abruptness was what traveled through the room. First, the absence of the sound that should have followed the particular quality of a note that never arrived. The conversations nearest the door fell quiet first, and the quiet moved inward through the barn, the way a tide moves steady and without negotiation, taking the children's voices with it, and the clatter of forks and the low private laughter from the tables in the back corners. 200 people went still. Clark Drummond walked through the barn doors. He was dressed in a black suit that had no business being worn in a Montana summer barn, and he wore it with the authority of a man who has decided that his own comfort is a concern for someone else to manage. His face was clean-shaved and composed, and he moved through the space that opened for him with the ease of someone who has walked into rooms as the most powerful person present often enough that the opening up of rooms is something he expects rather than notices. Deputy Loren Wick walked on his right. The deputy was young, under 30, with a badge that caught the light from the high windows as he moved. He wore the expression of a man who had been given an assignment and was somewhere in the middle of reconsidering it. Behind them, two men, large and quiet with the particular stillness of men who have been hired for their capability and are waiting to be asked to apply it. Drummond stopped in the center of the floor. He looked around the room slowly. The pause before speaking was a tool he had used in hundreds of rooms, and he used it here, giving the silence room to solidify into something useful. Good afternoon. His voice was trained and carried without effort the voice of railroad dinners and civic committees and rooms full of men who needed to be persuaded of things. I apologize for interrupting your gathering. I have a matter of justice to bring before this community, and I am grateful for your patience in hearing it. He said his name. He said why he was there. He described Vera Calloway in the language of a man reluctantly performing a necessary duty with measured sorrow in the tone of someone who would have preferred any other outcome. The stolen locket, the breach of trust, the flight. He said it all in the version he had been building and refining for 10 days, knowing which parts landed and which needed the support of the sentence that followed. He produced the warrant and held it up so the seal was visible. He had a witness. He gestured toward the back of the room, and a man came forward, wide-set eyes and an open expression, and the scar above the left eyebrow, moving with the specific confidence of someone who has done this before in other rooms and knows what the job looks like when it is done correctly. The room was watching Vera. She was at the food table with her hands at her sides and the locket at her throat, and 200 people's attention landing on her all at once, which is a weight that has nothing to do with numbers and everything to do with the years of accumulated smallness that a weight like that can find and press against. 10 days of stories, 3 counties of notices, a lifetime of learning to disappear. The smallness was trying to happen. She could feel it pulling at her from the inside, the familiar, practiced efficiency of a habit that knows exactly where the seams are and how to work them. Drummond looked at her across the barn. His voice was not unkind. That was the most frightening part of it. Miss Calloway, do you deny taking the locket? The barn held its breath. Vera opened her mouth. Nothing came out. The light from the high windows fell across the floor between her and Drummond, and the room was enormous and full of faces and the accumulated weight of a story told so many times it had calcified into truth, and she could feel herself shrinking back into the shape she had spent her adult life wearing, the shape of the woman in the background, the woman who did not take up space, the woman who stayed and worked and said yes ma'am and no ma'am and kept her eyes down because eyes down was survivable. Then she heard her name. Vera. One word, low and direct and coming from 10 feet to her left. She turned toward it the way a person turns toward light in a dark room, the body moving before the decision is made. Colt Mercer was standing with his arms at his sides and his hat level and his eyes on her face and nothing else. He was wearing the blue work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow and the brown leather vest worn soft with years of use, and he looked exactly as he had looked every morning at the gate and every evening on the porch and every quiet moment in between, which was to say steady and present and completely unimpressed by the size of the thing they were standing in front of. His eyes said what they had been saying since the morning she fell through his gate. Not pity, not strategy, not rescue, just the simple, irreducible fact of someone who sees you and is there. She breathed in, she breathed out, she stepped forward, one step, then another, and then she was walking the way a person walks when they have somewhere to be and have decided to go there, and The crowd opened the way, crowds open for people who have made a decision, and she walked until she was standing 6 feet from Clark Drummond in the center of Hanson's barn, with 200 people around her, and her chin level and her hands steady. She looked at him. "I took it," she said. The room made a sound, not loud. The sound of 200 people breathing in at slightly different times, which together sounds like nothing and also sounds like everything. Drummond's composure was excellent. He almost smiled. "Because it's mine," Vera said. The almost smile held where it was but did not advance. She reached under the collar of her dress and unclasped the locket from her neck. She held it up so the room could see it, this small silver oval on its thin chain, tarnished and dented and worn in the way that objects become worn when they have been carried close to the body for years, and through miles, and through grief, and through everything that follows grief. "My mother gave me this locket," she said. "I clasped it around my son's neck the morning he was born. His name was Jacob Calloway. He was born on the 3rd of June. He died on the 9th of August in the house of the man standing in front of you right now. He was 11 weeks old." The barn was completely quiet. She opened the locket. She removed the piece of paper. She held it between her fingers, and she said, "When I took this locket back from Mrs. Drummond's jewelry case, I did not know what was inside it. I had never opened it. I found out the night I arrived at Mercer Ranch." She unfolded the paper. She read it aloud. "Forgive me. I should have called for you." The words went into the room, and the room received them and held them the way certain words are held, with the specific weight of things that are true. Drummond's composure did not break. It was too refined for that. But something shifted underneath it, some load-bearing element that had been supporting the structure quietly, and the people nearest him saw something change in his face without being able to name exactly what had changed. "That is not my wife's handwriting," he said. His voice was still smooth and still carried. "I have no knowledge of that paper or its origin. This woman is—" "I do." The voice came from the left side of the barn, from a corner near the wall, where a woman had been sitting alone on a wooden chair since before most people had arrived, sitting so still and so quietly in the shadows at the edge of the gathered crowd that she had been present through the entire morning without any of the 200 people in the barn registering her presence. Constance Drummond stood up. She was slight in her late 40s, dressed plainly with her dark hair pulled back, and she had the quality of stillness about her that is not peace, but its opposite. The stillness of someone who has been holding something in place through sustained effort for a very long time and has arrived at the place where the effort is no longer possible. Her face was pale. Her hands clasped in front of her were steady with the deliberate steadiness of a decision. She looked at her husband. He looked at her. The entire barn watched this. 200 people watching two people look at each other, which is one of the few performances that does not require distance to be witnessed fully. She said 3 words. She said them quietly, meant for him and not for the room, but the room heard them because the room had stopped breathing, and the barn had never in 30 years of harvests been this quiet. "I told you," she said. "I told you we should have called for her." The sound that moved through the barn then was older than a gasp and different from a murmur. It was the sound a community makes when it understands simultaneously and without individual decision that it has been deceived about something that mattered, that the story it had been given to believe was the frame around a truth that had been hidden inside it, and the truth was worse than the story. Clark Drummond looked at his wife for a long moment. Then he looked at the room. His face was still composed, but it was composed the way a structure is composed in the moment before it gives way, holding the form, having lost the substance that gave the form its meaning. "This is theater," he said, and his voice was still trained and still carried. "This woman is a domestic who stole from my household and is now constructing an elaborate—" "The man you brought as your witness," Cody Marsh said, stepping out of the crowd with the piece of paper he had kept inside his vest for 7 days, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the barn, "is on a Wyoming wanted notice under a different name. I saw his face in Cheyenne 2 years ago on a wall in a rooming house near the train depot. He is not a witness. He is a professional liar who sells false testimony for money, and I will swear to that fact in any court you want to name before any judge who will hear it." The hired witness looked at Cody. Then he looked at the exits. Fen Aldridge was standing at the east door with his arms folded. Birch was at the west door, leaning against the frame with a particular quality of presence that suggested he was not planning to move. The witness stayed where he was and said nothing. Holt walked out of the crowd and took a position behind Colt, and Cody came to stand beside Holt. And the hands arranged themselves the way people arrange themselves when they have decided something important and want to be visible about it. Shoulder beside shoulder, not threatening, not dramatic, just present and committed, and clearly not going anywhere. The kind of arrangement that says this is where we stand without requiring anyone to say it. Then Sam Cole pulled his hand free of Cody's, which he had technically still been holding, and walked directly across the barn floor toward Vera with the absolute unhesitating directness of a 7-year-old who has identified exactly where he is supposed to be and is going there. He stood beside her. He looked up at Clark Drummond with the fearless clarity of someone who has not yet learned that size is supposed to mean something. "You cannot take her," he said. His voice was clear and completely serious. "She makes the best biscuits in Montana, and she is teaching me to cook, and she cried for her son behind the barn one night when she thought nobody was watching, and she got back up and came inside and made breakfast for everyone the next morning, and she is a good person, and you are a bad man, and you cannot have her." A woman somewhere in the crowd made a sound that was halfway between a laugh and something that had been held in too long. And then another woman. The sound traveled through the barn and arrived in the traveling at something different than where it had started, at the particular quality of emotional release that only comes when something true has been said in a room that has been waiting for truth to arrive. Agnes Cole came forward from where she had been standing near the center of the crowd. She walked to the open space and stood beside Vera and faced Drummond with the posture of a woman who has been waiting to say something for a year and is saying it now. "I was a guest in your house for 3 weeks last spring," she said. "I was in your hallway the morning Jacob died. I watched your wife come downstairs carrying that child. I heard you tell her we will handle it. I watched that baby go into the ground that same afternoon before his mother had been told he was gone." Her voice was even and did not ask for anything from the room. "And I know, because I made the mistake of staying silent when I should not have, that this was not the first time something like this happened in your house. There was another girl before Vera Calloway, another infant, another burial done quickly and quietly. You buried the children, and then you buried the truth, and then you destroyed the mothers who might have asked questions. I am telling you now in front of everyone in this valley what I saw. I am willing to put it in writing before any authority who asks." The room was completely still. Drummond looked at Deputy Wick. "Deputy," he said, "execute the warrant now." Deputy Lauren Wick had been standing to Drummond's right for the past several minutes with the expression of a man taking an examination he is not prepared for and is beginning to suspect he may not pass. He had the warrant in his hand. He looked at it. He looked at Constance Drummond, still standing by the wall where she had stood up, still looking at her husband with the expression of a woman on the other side of a decision. He looked at the paper in Vera's hand. He looked at Cody's Wyoming notice. He looked at Sam Cole, 7 years old, standing next to Vera, with the expression of someone who will not be moving. He folded the warrant. He put it in his coat pocket. "Mr. Drummond," he said, "I am not executing this warrant today." Drummond's jaw tightened. "You have a legal instrument signed by a sitting. I have a direct witness to what happened in your house, whose testimony directly contradicts your account. I have documented evidence that the witness you presented is a known criminal operating under a false name. I have a note in your wife's own handwriting that asks a question a judge in Helena is going to need to answer." He paused. "And I have just watched your wife stand up in a room with 200 people and say something that no innocent man's wife stands up and says." The room held. Colt stepped forward 1 step. He did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. "Mr. Drummond," he said, "you will leave this valley today. You will ride back to that hotel and collect your things and keep riding until you reach Helena. Because if you are still in Harrow Flats when I wake up tomorrow morning, I will ride to Helena personally and file a formal petition with Marshal Grant Fuller to investigate the death of Jacob Calloway. I have Agnes Cole's testimony, your wife's written statement, Cody Marsh's sworn identification of your hired witness, and every person in this building as a witness to what has happened here today. That is what you are looking at." He let it settle. "Your choice," he said. Clark Drummond stood in the center of Hanson's barn, and looked at the room, and the room looked back at him, and the arithmetic that he had been doing his whole life finally produced an answer he had not arranged for. He looked at his wife, who did not look away from him, who had not looked away from him since she stood up, whose face held the expression of a woman who has set something down that she has been carrying for a very long time and is standing on the other side of it. He turned and walked out of the barn. His two hired men followed. Deputy Wick lingered at the door for a moment, then looked at Vera and removed his hat briefly, the gesture of a man who has not done enough and knows it and is doing the small thing that is still available to him. Then he left. The barn doors closed. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The barn held 200 people in the kind of stillness that only exists right before something changes. Then Sam Cole said in the clear and caring voice of a boy who has exercised considerable patience and considers the situation resolved, "Can we eat now? I have been standing here for a very long time, and I am genuinely, seriously hungry." The barn broke open, not all at once. More like ice in the late spring, the way it releases in pieces, the way one sound leads to another, and then another until the whole surface is moving and you cannot identify where it started. Laughter, and the other things that live next to laughter and come out at the same time, and women moving across the floor toward Vera, and the fiddle player starting up again fast and high and celebratory without being asked, and the children who had been watching the adults with the keen attention that children bring to things they do not understand but recognize as important, beginning to run again because the rules had clearly changed. Women came to Vera, not all of them immediately and not all of them at all, because some things take longer than a single afternoon to unknot themselves. But women came and she received them, and she fed them from what remained on the tables, because feeding people was what she knew how to do, and it was what the moment needed, and some situations are best addressed through the ordinary work of hands rather than through the elaborate work of words. Mrs. Prine came last. She stood in front of Vera for a long moment with her hands clasped in front of her, which was how she stood when she was holding herself together, and her eyes were bright with the specific brightness of something that has been held in too long. "I listened to a stranger," she said. "I closed my store to people I had served for 7 years on the strength of a story told in a saloon over bought drinks. That is not who I believe I am." "It's all right," Vera said. "It is not." "No," Vera agreed, "but it will be." Mrs. Prine nodded once tightly, the kind of nod that is a commitment rather than an acknowledgement, and went back to her family. Holt found Vera later in the evening after the food was mostly finished and the crowd had begun to thin, and Sam had fallen asleep on a folded blanket in the far corner, with one hand still wrapped loosely around a half-eaten biscuit. Holt stopped in front of her and held his hat in both hands, which was something she had never seen him do. "I don't know what happens next with the law," he said. "I don't know if it goes the way it ought to. Neither do I. But today went the right way." He looked at his hat. "For Lily, and for your boy." She stepped forward and put her arms around him. He went completely rigid for a moment, every muscle in his body conducting a rapid and inconclusive internal argument about the situation. Then his arms came up slowly, the way they come up when a man is relearning something he thought he had forgotten how to do, and he held on for a moment just long enough, and then he stepped back and cleared his throat and put his hat back on. "Don't tell Cody," he said. "I won't." He walked toward the door without looking back. But Vera looked at his shoulders as he went, and they carried something differently than they had when he came in. Fen Aldridge had remained at the back wall since the doors closed, arms folded, watching the room with his usual undemonstrative attention. He had not moved to speak to anyone or to celebrate anything. He had simply continued to be present, which was what he did, and which was worth more than most people's most vigorous efforts. When Vera caught his eye across the thinning crowd, he gave her the single, slow nod he had been giving her since the first morning, the one that said what it said without requiring amplification. She nodded back. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the gathering in the morning mail that Cody brought from town. He set it on the kitchen table with both hands and stepped back from it with the specific caution you bring to something you are not entirely sure about, and every person in the kitchen stopped what they were doing. Marshall Grant Fuller, Helena, official correspondence with the seal intact. Vera dried her hands on her apron. She picked it up. She broke the seal and read it once, and then, because the first reading did not seem real, read it again. Her knees found the chair. The marshal had opened a formal inquiry into the death of Jacob Calloway. The circumstances of the burial expedited without a physician's examination of the body and conducted before the child's mother had been informed of the death, together with the sworn testimony of Agnes Cole and the report submitted by Deputy Lauren Wick, had provided sufficient grounds for investigation. Clark Drummond and Dr. Prescott had been summoned to appear. Constance Drummond had already submitted a voluntary written statement to the marshal's office. At the bottom of the letter, in the marshal's own handwriting, rather than the formal typeface of the official text, he had added 3 sentences. He wrote that a child had died in that house and nobody had asked how. He wrote that asking how even this late was the right thing to do. He wrote that she should expect further correspondence. Vera set the letter on the table. Her hands were shaking, but it was not the shaking she had known at the pump on the first night, or at the barn before she spoke, or in the 100 moments of the past 10 days when her hands had registered what her voice could not. This was different. This was the shaking of something releasing the body's way of setting down a weight that has been carried so long the muscles have learned the shape of it and do not immediately know how to stop. "Someone is finally asking," she said. "What happened to my son?" Agnes pressed her hand against her chest. Cody said something under his breath that expressed how he felt clearly and completely. Holt set his coffee cup down and looked at the wall for a moment with the expression of a man having a private conversation with something he has been carrying for 20 years. Sam had been standing on his stool beside Vera at the counter. He looked at her face, then at the letter, then at her face again, reading the situation the way he read everything through the people in it rather than through the facts. "Does that mean the bad man is in trouble now?" he said. Vera looked at him. She was crying, which she had not noticed until his face came into focus, this 7-year-old face with its gap and its perpetual disorder of hair, and its brown eyes that saw everything and judged nothing. She found she could not stop and did not particularly want to. "Yes, Sam," she said, "the bad man is in trouble now." Sam considered this for a moment with the gravity it deserved. Then he made a sharp, emphatic gesture with his fist that expressed his position on the matter without requiring any further comment. 2 days after the letter, Colt came into the kitchen at mid-morning and set a folded document on the table beside her breadboard and stood by the window looking out at the fence line the way he looked at things he had already decided about. She wiped her hands on her apron. She looked at the document, then at him. She unfolded it. It was a deed. 40 acres along the South Creek, surveyed and mapped with the official precision of county records. Filed at the land office. Stamped and witnessed and real. Her name was on it in the formal typeface that counties use for things they intended to be permanent. Vera Calloway, not on a wanted notice or a warrant, but on a piece of property that belonged to her. She read it twice. "Colt, you stay here," he said, still looking out at the fence. "You stay because you own a piece of this place. Nobody lent it to you and nobody can take it back. You go with something in your hands that no one in the world can call stolen." He turned from the window. "Either way, you've got ground under your feet that's yours." She set the deed flat on the table and pressed her palm against it. 2 things she owned now in the specific and legal sense that no one could dispute: the locket and this. It was more than she had walked through that gate with which had been nothing at all, and she was not going to pretend it was anything less than everything. "Thank you," she said. He picked up his hat from the hook by the door. "Biscuits are getting cold," he said, and went back outside. She stood at the table with her hand on the deed and the locket warm at her throat and the kitchen around her, doing what it had been doing since the first morning that she stood in it, holding everything steadily in place the way a good kitchen does. 3 weeks after that, Vera came into the kitchen at dawn to find Colt's hat on the table. Not on its hook by the door or on the railing. Placed deliberately on the table and beside it, a small circle of silver, no wider than a man's thumb. She stood in the doorway. Then she went to the counter and began the biscuit dough because her hands needed something familiar to do while the rest of her worked out what was happening. She heard Colt come in from the porch. She did not turn around. "You said you could cook," he said. "I can." She heard him come to the table. She heard him pick up the ring. She heard his boots cross the floor toward her, and she felt the presence of him the way she had felt it since the first evening at the pump, unhurried and steady, and asking nothing she was not ready to give. "That's all I need," he said. She turned around. He was holding the ring out to her in the unadorned plain way that he did most things without ceremony and without performance, just the direct honest offering of something he meant. She looked at him. This man in the blue shirt and the worn leather vest with his quiet eyes and his weathered face and the particular quality of decency that had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with the willingness to be where something required a person to be. This man who had read a note in a silver locket and understood in 30 seconds what it meant and had not let her run. She took the ring from his hand. She slid it onto her finger. It fit the way things fit when they have found where they belong. She put both hands, flower and all, on either side of his face, and she kissed him, and he held her the way he held everything in his life, with both hands in full intention and the complete absence of any plan to let go. They were married on a Saturday on the porch of Mercer Ranch, which was the right place for it in every way. Agnes wove wildflowers through the porch railing and made it look like something deliberate without appearing to trim him. Sam wore a clean shirt, which Agnes confirmed was unprecedented in his recorded history, and stood beside Colt with the formal gravity of a boy who understood he had been given a significant responsibility and intended to fulfill it without incident. He managed this for the entire duration of the ceremony, which was the longest period of voluntary stillness anyone had ever observed in him, and was discussed afterward as remarkable. The hands stood in a line, Holt and Cody and Fenn and Birch and Dupree with the clean shirts and combed hair and once polished boots of men who have made a special occasion of something they would not have predicted a month ago and have decided it was worth the effort. They stood the way men stand when they are not certain what their faces should be doing for a formal occasion and have settled on serious as the safest available option. Vera wore the green cotton dress she had made over the past several weeks. From fabric she had come by through a series of conversations and pie recipes and the gradual rebuilding of something that had been broken and was now not repaired exactly, but rebuilt differently and possibly stronger. She wore the locket at her throat. She walked to Colt across the porch boards, and he watched her come the way he had watched her since the morning she fell through his gate, with his full attention and nothing held back. A traveling preacher said the words. They said their vows. Simple ones, the kind that mean more because they do not try to hold everything. I'll stand with you, Colt said. I'll feed you, Vera said. The porch laughed, all of it at once, and the laughter was the kind that comes from the deep end of the chest where things have been stored for a while and have finally been given permission. Holt shook Colt's hand with both of his own, which was more than Holt had given anyone in recent memory. You did good, he said. I got lucky, Colt said. Yeah, Holt said. You did. Then he turned to Vera and removed his hat and held it against his chest with both hands and looked at her with the expression of a man who has arrived somewhere he did not expect to arrive and is still in the process of understanding how it happened. Welcome home, Mrs. Mercer, he said. She took his hand in hers. I've been home since the first biscuit. Holt. His mouth did the thing it sometimes did, not a smile exactly, the outline of one. The shape of a smile worn on the face of a man who had decided somewhere along the way that smiling was a form of expenditure he could not always justify, but who occasionally found himself reconsidering. They ate, which was not incidental to the occasion, but was in its way the entire point of it. The long table set in the yard with 2 days of Vera's cooking, the kind of table that makes a place feel like what it actually is, which is a home that has decided to remain one. Sam ate until he genuinely could not, and then found reserves and ate more. Cody told 3 jokes that he alone found fully satisfying, but that produced in others the good-natured tolerance that is its own kind of affection. Agnes declared the meal superior to both of her own wedding receptions, which she said was meant as the highest possible compliment and should be received as such. Fenn ate at the end of the table with the complete focused attention he gave to everything, and at one point he caught Vera's eye and gave her the nod, and it was enough. Later, after the table had been cleared, and Agnes had carried Sam up to the loft and the hands had drifted to the bunkhouse and the evening had settled into the kind of quiet that follows celebration, when the celebrating has been done correctly. Vera stood alone in the kitchen. She looked at the stove. She looked at the counter and the table and the chair she had fallen into on the first afternoon with nothing left, hands shaking, 4 days empty, the skillet clanging on the floor beside her. She looked at all of it for a long moment with the particular attention you give a place when you understand that it is yours in a way that goes beyond ownership. She reached out and put her hand on the cast iron skillet sitting on the stove, the same one she had carried across 60 miles of Montana summer tied to her belt with a strip of leather. The one that had fed a table of strangers and made them into something else. The one thing she had held on to when she had let go of everything else, because it was the one thing that was entirely hers and could not be taken. Not the skillet itself, but what it meant, which was that she could feed people, she could make a table feel like shelter. She could take whatever was available and turn it into something that made people stop and be present for a moment, and no one had ever found a way to take that from her. It sat on the stove of her kitchen in her house on her land, exactly where it was supposed to be. She pressed her hand flat against the iron, which was cool now, which had given everything it had to the day, and was resting. "We made it, Jacob," she said softly in the voice she kept for him, the one that belonged to the space between her and what she carried. "Mama made it." The words went into the kitchen, and the kitchen held them the way it held everything in the walls and the floor, and the smell of bread and smoke, and the particular warmth of a room that has been used for its purpose and is now resting after it. She heard Colt's boots on the porch, the specific weight and rhythm of them steady and familiar, the sound of a man coming home to a place that has decided to be one. He appeared in the doorway and leaned against the frame the way he leaned when he had nowhere particular to be and was choosing to be here. And he looked at her with those quiet eyes that had seen all of it, the gate and the kitchen and the barn and the table, and every morning and every evening between, and had not looked away from any of it. "Coming to bed, Mrs. Mercer." She untied her apron. She hung it on the hook by the door where it would be in the morning when she needed it. She turned down the lamp and let the kitchen settle into the restful dark of a room that is not empty, but at peace. She took his hand. They stepped off the porch together and into the warm Montana night, where the stars were in their full abundance above the basin, and the grass was moving in a slow wind that had been traveling from somewhere distant and had somewhere further still to go. Behind them, the kitchen stood quiet and warm, the skillet on the stove, the locket on the nightstand upstairs resting for the night, the deed to 40 acres in the drawer by the window with Vera's name on it, in the permanent way of things that have been decided and recorded and are no longer subject to revision by anyone. The ranch settled around them the way a place settles when it has finally become what it was always meant to be. Not in a single moment, not with any announcement. Just the quiet accumulation of ordinary things in the right order, which is how homes are made when they are made to last. Not given, not borrowed, not stolen. Earned one meal at a time, one truth at a time, one stubborn and impossible act of staying when everything in the world said to go. Vera Calloway had walked through that gate with nothing but a skillet and 3 words, and she had been right about both of them. She could cook. That was enough.